Hello everyone, today I want to talk about a different topic from the usual that I have already addressed actually last year, I think, I think it was last autumn, regarding the famed historical-based video game Rome Total War and some of the modifications of the players' communities and the so-called modders, of which I also am part still, albeit in a very private fashion. Regarding the impact that these works that are really impressive in terms of actual, well, the work altogether, the time I know better because I spent an awful lot of wasted an awful lot of time changing some things myself, but also the great actual historical research existing behind that, and the effect rendered, how this influenced essentially the popular view on history, in this case of ancient history, etc. So first of all, I will say this, that the historical research here, you know that I'm quite picky in general, and so I'm not going to overstate, let's say, the historical quality per se of these mods that is quite high anyhow, but for a mod, for a video game, right? So there is a lot of historical research behind that. I've never thoroughly participated in the forums of these communities, and so I don't know what actual debates existed outside doors, by the way, because I know that the teams working on this were somewhat, not secretive, but they wanted to be left alone, legitimately working how they wanted to do the thing. I know also that teamwork can be difficult. I never personally worked in team. I'm just by default a lone wolf. I had the opportunity to create a sub mod at some point, and I'm still ideally working on. Actually, I stopped from years now because of all the things that I have been up to, including Schwerpunkt, by the way, that are way more useful and interesting than video gaming. But I thought, given a look at these two mods that I've played thoroughly myself, we're talking about now more than 10 years ago, frankly, because those were the days. And what is extraordinary about the video game in itself, and in fact, I realized that thanks to the success of the video I made regarding the tactical accuracy of the game mechanics, is how, for a 2004, if I'm not wrong, game, how still played it is, how still loved and appreciated it is, right? Some video games are still played because they're a bit niche. I'm, for example, one of those old fellows who still play Operation Flashpoint, Cold War Crisis, hyper modded and everything. Every once in a while, for 5 minutes, I want to shoot someone, and that seems legitimate, especially when actually I spend a lot of time also. I used to spend a lot of time in mission editing and with a lot of interesting things, but even that game is limited. Rome Total War has been, together with Medieval 2, and I think there's been a decline after that, even though people are still kind of enthusiastic of the series, etc. And personally not. Rome 2, in my opinion, was a flop. I wanted to buy it back in the day, but I realized that doesn't matter how patched and and enriched it is, even by same modding, which sometimes is really fantastic, right? It doesn't. I've seen recently they've done something. They have unlocked number of settlements. They've done all the things that, as Rome Total War modders, we would like to see at some point. But there are other things that cannot be modified, and altogether the game mechanics are a bit weird. And so I think that Rome was actually, I think Medieval 2 was actually the best, video game in vanilla, or at least as it came out with all the features and so on. I think Rome was still relatively limited, but I think Rome's mods surpassed by far the one of Medieval 2 that also had some limits. And as you know, I'm a medievalist, so you would have expected to like more Medieval 2 Total War. It's not really the case, but I played that for a very long time. There are also interesting medieval-based mods for Rome Total War. Some are very neatly done, but even there, I stuck to these games again as long as I could modify them. This is the reason I spend more time modding than than actual playing. And as I was saying before, I basically don't do it anymore. At this point, I don't have time during the day to dedicate to that. But still, my head a bit revolves around certain aspects. And I love the aforementioned mods, right? So first of all, that Roma Surrectum 2, I will call it like this, even though it's wrong, the Latin adjective, the gender, etc. But it's stuck like as RS2, Roma Surrectum 2, and Europa Barbarorum are really neat things to see. Like if you have any interest in that period they cover, this is essentially the from the 3rd to the 3rd century BC to maybe the Common Era, let's say, and beyond. They are really something, right? I never played thoroughly with Barbarian Invasion either, because I think that after all the mods they made were not so thoroughly researched, like these two giants, right? And that's why I talk about them in this pretty hot summer that frankly makes me digress on these topics. As you know, I do it very rarely, but again, I think you can squeeze something out of the historical bucket presented by these works. So I will not even present these two mods, if not by simply criticizing them, right? So all you have to know is that they basically start from the same engine, the same game, and so they tend to evolve also towards similar patterns, right? There's not so many things you can do in these mods. The best thing you can do essentially is to complicate the game by adding more variables that will eventually make this system, say, less predictable in a way, or at least say more complex and deeper, right? And the first problem is actually the one that all mods have, that in theory there is all a philosophy of thought. I was saying it also in the other video. People say, well, this is just a video game, right? It's supposed to, it's historically based, so evidently who plays it has some interest in historical accuracy from one side, but from the other, right, you can essentially change the course of history, and therefore you shouldn't be troubled if, like it happens also not just with mods that actually tend to curb this, but actually with the other games of the series, to actually have to enjoy the randomness of how the campaign can turn out to be. And I disagree strongly with the latter point, because it's not that I want to see, the Romans winning all the time necessarily, even though my favorite faction always tend to actually replicate the Roman Empire. And in my sub-mod, I've essentially taken all the steps to simulate all the factions, kind of historical type of expansion, both by scale and intensity, and chronologically speaking. It's an extremely difficult thing, because it takes a lot of scripting, a lot of testing, it takes away a lot of time. But at the same time, what I want, of course, is to change history, meaning that I want to simulate the actual course of history so that at some point you can reverse it, right? If there is a major battle, I want to play it in a way that, the winner has some better chance of winning automatically, because sometimes you're not even the faction that maybe it's just artificial intelligence versus artificial intelligence, but let's assume you're a Thracian and you're looking at the clash between the Romans and the Antigonids in Greece, and so that's you're standing there and you want to see, ideally, right, say, if you have to prefer something, like ideally it would be good to see the thing all naturally balanced, both politically and strategically. But if you want to make things going, generally speaking, in a certain way, because you think it was, in fact, it's more historically plausible for things to have gone that way, you will tend to give an edge to, in that case, the Romans or whatever. So a slight edge, right? Not like a crushing thing you cannot win as an Antigonid, for example. I want to play as an Antigonid and, say, winning Kynoskephali or Pydna, etc. But it should be kind of more difficult than just a walk in the park, right? So it's very complicated to make the whole thing, and the only way I think it's possible to do is via script, because fundamentally, these factions have no intelligence. They are dumb. They do strange things. They expand towards unfavorable directions. They very often have an inner dynamic that you can't even quite change because it depends on things like overpowered units. This is a problem since the old vanilla, right? That you have, I don't know, the Egyptians or the Britons taking over because they have overpowered units, and they, it doesn't make much sense. But you want to flatten, and so these mods have tended to actually, flatten the differences, making the thing kind of, generally speaking, more attritional for everyone involved. Via script, also, what they mostly did, especially Roma Surrectum 2, that has a lot of money going in, and it's kind of an hypertrophic mod. Now we're talking about that, tending to reduce income as large the empire becomes, which is technically something that already happens just by the way you tend to play and the accidents that happen along the way. So my objective as a modder is to make actually the simplest system, but with the easiest, with the simplest play, right? But that is difficult at the same time, and unavoidably that has to become complex in many ways, and very complex, but still not in a way that you feel overburdened. And in fact, the criticism that I have towards these mods is that in a way or another they both skip this problem. Like most mods and most of these titles, if not all of them, nobody really cared to say we want to try to simulate, let's say, the historical expansion of factions historically, given their possibilities, their background, etc. At some point, somebody said, especially in Europa Barbarorum, that does make a lot of historical scripting. Okay, we should start with some good historical, very refined, actually, historical balance, politically, strategically, and even setting some scripts that kind of simulate certain historical events, etc., but that overall are somewhat influent. In a way, still these factions expand, right? And telling it all, let's say, between the two mods, I really prefer, I don't know which one still I prefer, but I played the most and liked the most, I guess, Europa Barbarorum, for a reason that is always this kind of dreaming, kind of in function of dreaming the mod that I want to have, right? Roma Surrectum 2, however, was also the most thrilling in a sense when it came out, especially the 2.5 version, because I don't remember which one was older, because the series of these two mods that came out gradually, but let's say Roma Surrectum 2 2.5, that is one I played, I think, then I played 2.6, but there have been other updates. Was like the big title as well, the one that could really rival and compete with the same Europa Barbarorum. And investing instead much more, let's say, on the graphical side of the story, which is pretty amazing, but I also, also needless by a certain degree. And with another game philosophy, so with another outcome that, in this sense, I can't yet say whether it's kind of more historically accurate or not, because first of all, I see these games as strategic simulators, in a sense. There's a very few, let's say that there is much more tactical depth in this game than the strategical one. At least in the strictly strategical sense of the term, like what you can do with an army, how you can influence also the enemy ones. It's all pretty flat, telling the truth. So the most important thing mostly lays on kind of how many resources you have, how long it takes to recruit other armies, what's the enemy progress on the broader map, but not really like a strategic duel between two armies in a campaign. There ain't really anything like that. Tactically wise, I make that video, and I told you what's wrong with the broader thing, and unfortunately certain things cannot be modified at the core, but still it's pretty nice, even from a visual point of view, to play these mods and look and say, well, this is, I know it's a game, but it's maybe closer to anything I've ever seen, to an ancient battle, right? Considering movies and all other popular ideas, because at the end of the day, the people who worked at this mods are people who are interested in the historical accuracy, right? right? Even when they do things that are not that accurate. The reason why I like Europa Barbarorum the most is the premise of the mod, right? In the beginning of the campaign, when you begin in this mod, first of all, the broader philosophy, as you understand from the game, is title itself is a bit having a individual perspective, all the various cultures that existed in the ancient world. The map is geographically very wide, which means that it's larger by scale, and there is actually less detail as a consequence from a strictly local point of view. But the mod actually makes a good job, terrific job to say the least, at compensating that by making not just kind of an atmospheric kind of local reality alive in a sense, but caring very much about the non-flattery view of what ancient cultures really were at that point, right? If you're going to play with the Germans, I don't know, you see how primitive and very much so that they were. How, let's say, you can almost perceive the mindset, these peoples from this type of armies that you are bringing in the field, which is not automatic. It's not to be given for granted. Somebody did it for you. Somebody arranged that set, that unit roster, that type of, beginning of the campaign with an idea and a dynamic that in there is very seducing. Because what I like of this mod is also that it's a very the economy is generally speaking very poor. You can feel how archaic this world is. It starts in 270 BC, right? So there are a few buildings, right? Basically the entire way this game develops is that you actually build stuff in the various settlements that you have to conquer, right? All over the map. Like, you have to take over the world. There are these provinces. Every province has a capital, and in this capital you can build markets, sanitary structures, and so on. And that's a very important balance, because essentially, as you know, in pre-industrial societies, growth, economically speaking, was barely perceived in a lifetime, right? So in this video games, instead, the thing is much speeded up, right? You pick the 200 years, let's say, of a campaign, you realize that, the GDP has decuplicated for the single settlement, and it's ridiculous, of course, all over the world. So there is a broader development that perplexes you a little bit, because especially in Europa Barbarorum, yes, there are a few buildings, and so this seems all very poorly primitive, like it was at the time, like, there's a very slow growth, etc. But you basically arrive, and also this happens for a choice, because they decided to lengthen also the time, right? Instead of having 6 months turns, they have, like, allegedly 3 months turns, and so it also mismatches with the character's aging, which could not be modified. So it's a bit weird. I never really liked that about Europa Barbarorum. It kind of got on my nerves all the time. And what happens is that by, let's say, 100 BC, you already have all the world basically having topped all the structures, all the city. There are metropolises everywhere, right? These settlements all look alike because you completed all the building tree, etc. So this is a beautiful mod that represents in depth so many different cultures and peoples in great historical accuracy, and we'll see also partly how this works. But it doesn't give you the opportunity, say, to arrive to something that goes beyond, like, just in a couple of centuries and kind of feeling this game is going anywhere, right? Speaking of the accuracy of the units, right? Europa Barbarorum makes a great job, in my opinion, at showing again not much such accuracy in the details or the information that you're provided with thanks to these units, to these models, with these costumes, etc. But rather through the tone of the local realities, right? If you step, in Britain, right, you immediately are acquainted with uniquely Brittonic units, with very specific kind of architecture of monuments and local wonders. The even the say the environment, speaking properly of the climate, of the terrain, the ground types, etc. That was Europa Barbarorum is quite conservative, right? It has almost a vanilla type of environment, and it's quite good because the original game made, in my opinion, a terrific job at simulating the various weathers of the various areas of the world, various lights, etc. Europa Barbarorum adds something more. There are certain areas, especially I don't know in the Iraqi marshes, all this kind of things. There is a different vegetation, whatever. But it's all very plain. It's very simple, very smooth. Right? When you played Roma Surrectum 2, they had to make light effects everywhere. The weather is always kind of in the way. You see strange environments. There is also kind of the map is not very well done from a properly from a terrain point of view. For example, there is never a beach in Roma Surrectum 2, which is something instead that I modified with ground tabs. I really want to fight battles on beaches, for example, on the shore with waves going back and forth. It's one of my favorites since the vanilla. In Roma Surrectum 2, they made the splendid graphics, etc. They never cared about this. All the coasts go straight into the sea from, without a flat area, right? Just they arrive 50 meters on the sea and then they fall down, right? And it's not cliffs. It's technically meant to be an average coastline. It's simply not likable. The only thing Europa Barbarorum maybe gets on your nerves, is that it maintained the old Rome Total War kind of thick forest type with this massive giant, was a giant sequoia type of trees everywhere that covers everything. You can't see anything while fighting in the forest, and it's kind of like a punch in the eye, frankly. I worked with a minor mod which was very well done, and it had a unique kind of type of trees. Roma Surrectum 2 made a good job with trees as well, vegetation as well, which is also, however, too hypertrophic, too much there, right? Roma Surrectum 2 has this strange idea of it's almost a surrealistic type of landscape, right? Overloaded in colors, in lights, in intensity, and it's too much. Right, you want to fight in places that are not like the scene of a kind of fantasy movie. You want to fight in a place that you say, okay, well, this looks like can't be like a normal landscape, which is something that you want to have also in terms of, for example, of relief. That not even I think Europa Barbarorum makes a good job at. They work pretty accurately on what kind of relief type they wanted to render, and there is a very good geographical feeling about that too, also because the scale of the map, as I was saying, is larger, so you can see geography more, like you see more far away, and the map is huge. It stretches from the Atlantic to basically, I remember what it Baikal Lake, but up to India practically. In the southeast, there is all Arabia, the Horn of Africa, and Scandinavia. I mean, it's really neatly done. And the reliefs are very, they calculated them to appear spectacular but still realistic. In Roma Surrectum 2, you have basically none of this. So it's what you see in the map in the close range is basically all what you should be contented with. And I don't think they made a good job in that. Everything is very actually cared for, like every vegetation type, this sense. For example, there's a typical Mediterranean flora and light at some point, and then there are different shades with more temperate forests than the north, but it becomes too kind of like it's simple, like a patch put in there, and always weighing on you. So I don't. That's one of the reasons why I don't like, but it can be easily modded, telling you the truth, and fixed for that reason. For the rest, actually, the strategic map is splendid. Probably Roma Surrectum 2 has the best strategic map. That instead is very shiny and beautiful, and that's the a bit the whole philosophy of the game, that all the panels, all the unit cards, building cards, etc., are very researched. The unit models are very good, right? But what you get with Europa Barbarorum is still the uniqueness of the regional context. So again, as I was saying before, you fight in Britain, you fight just against British troops. Like you find that type of hardcore kind of northwestern Celtic, more champion, kind of heroic warfare-based type of warfare mentality in atmosphere. The trick they used this like is that they didn't indulge on a specific faction rather than another. Roma Surrectum 2, as the title says, also focuses actually more on Rome than the other units, right? And the reason being that, first of all, the map is smaller, and Rome evidently kind of dominates the scene, also because the campaign starts later, starts at the end of the... No, actually, during the Second Punic War. I actually used Roma Surrectum to map myself for my mod. It starts from Zama instead, so it's the end. But we are still in a moment in which Rome is basically taking off, and so it's expected to take over also a bit all the Mediterranean as a consequence. And they made also a terrific job, and they are the best mod in this, at recreating all the various Roman historical legions with all the emblems, the shield patterns, etc. And this took away lots of other slots for other types of units. This doesn't exist in Europa Barbarorum. That actually, and I would say accurately, gives the Romans, in that kind of primitive hardcore feeling, actually a very few type of properly Roman units, right? And this is quite correct, because the mod starts, as I was saying, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, so you still have essentially the so-called chameleon type of legion, and there are various reforms. And I think Europa Barbarorum has, well, no, it's not the unique mod, but starting from that early on, effectively and accurately. And then, basically, as it happened with not much with the Polybian times, let's say, but with the Marian reform and the Augustan reform, you have just the only Roman units being the legionary infantry, and in the later times, some permanent type of professional permanent auxiliary unit types. Right, and all the rest correctly was provided essentially by allies, and Europa Barbarorum has actually a better, well, maybe not, but let's say it focuses more, at least, on the idea of the type of, let's say, gradual integration and, say, government types that you can extend over the conquered peoples, right? There are different layers, you can integrate them further along the way. Roma Surrectum 2 has this. And maybe in being simpler is also kind of easier and kind of better, right? You don't want to think too much. Europa Barbarorum sometimes makes you think too much about these choices that, as we've seen at the end of the day, do not eventually impact dramatically what you want to see happening in the game. And by having less, and so all the legionary units are alike. You can't recruit different legions in the sense that you can't recruit different. The way you recruit a legion is that you just recruit, if you want, one unit with eagle, there would be a cohort, and then other 9 without, right? And so you have a unit. So in fact, the problem also with Roma Surrectum 2 and the other type of mods that wanted to actually reproduce the historical legion types is that, sadly enough, you will never actually see those legions fighting in a campaign, right? Unless you are the Roman player, and so you can engineer that. But in the broader economy of the campaign, there is practically nothing aside from you're saying, oh, how cool it is that these guys look all alike, but they're still basically also in the stats the same type of units. So, in fact, I currently have a dilemma because the sub-mod I work on still has very good historical, legion, representation, but it takes away so many slots from the other unit models that makes me feel that the game could be deeper and more complete if I could have just one legionary type of unit and then creating other unit types for other cultures that would seem more characteristic. Well, Europa Barbarorum sticks to the latter thing. And so that's why it's so accurate, because, again, it provides a degree of homogeneity in the style of troops, ethnically, on a regional base, but still that degree of variety and plausibility for each one of them, that you say, I'm fighting, I don't know, in Germany, I'm fighting in Arabia, I'm fighting in Spain. I'm really seeing what it is like, right? I don't encounter strange units that, look kind of a bit like all the others, or standard types of, of units shared by multiple factions. No, everything is unique, and it's terrific, right? Yes, of course, there are, I don't know, some cultural areas, say that the Celtic world does have some basic units in common, but they're very few, and every Celtic region is also kind of very well represented on its own. Roma Surrectum 2 pays for not having this, in essentially having a massive unit model share. What does it mean? It means that, let's say, if I want to see an Axeman units in the barbarian world, I know that the Brittonic model, the Germanic model, the Galatian model, etc. is the same, right? Just change textures. And very often, it's so generic also in type of unit that even the description remains the same. So it feels like diluted. You say, well, but it's just an Axeman, right? It's pretty normal. How many ways are there to be an Axeman? Well, if you look at Europa Barbarorum, you have the answer, because everything is very accurately represented. The philosophy there is not that there is an Axeman, a random Axeman, is that there is a type of trooper that is being reconstructed on historical, archaeological basis with a broader panoply. So no Axeman is equal to another. And Europa Barbarorum, this has the advantage that because there is a broader maxi faction that represents the so-called slaves, the rebels, whatever, that is that basically can have all units depending on where the rebels rule, right? For example, I don't know. You know this who has played the game, but others may not know. In Gaul, if there are some provinces held by, let's say, the Aedui, and others are rebels, right? And so the unit model provides you with this possibility of having the same unit type, both for the rebels and the other factions. If you have a generic type of unit which is shared, or even worse, like it's often done in Roma Surrectum 2, you have a battle model that serves for lots of different types of units that probably also look different on the field. For example, there are lots of standard bearers that in Roma Surrectum 2 are varying with different texture, but the skeleton is the same, the base is the same of the model. You can't really have, for example, that unit for also the rebel units locally that looks like, I don't know, the German or the Briton. No, it will be all alike, and so it will be all standard. Naturally, the Roma Surrectum 2 modders have used type of models that maybe kind of fit broadly think, but sometimes you find certain standard bearers or even certain type of units somewhere that you say, but it's so generic, like it doesn't feel like this guy belongs to this specific culture, and it kind of dilutes the broader ethnicity of the place you're fighting in. And Europa Barbarorum instead is quite easy. It has just two models for normally, one for kind of the mercenary type of troop that can be used still like a normal one that looks in a way, and then the other one that has the skin both for a faction and the slave equivalent. And so every unit can be properly used only by a specific type of, in a specific type of context. You can also hire it, I don't know, if you're a Roman, you conquer that region in Gaul, you can recruit it as an auxiliary force, but it's that specific unit that is present only in Gaul. Instead, Roma Surrectum 2 makes kind of a broader mix-up, right? It makes you feel like the entire Central European area is a huge blend from which you can't even properly distinguish anything. And the historical point here is that inaccurate? Well, it's not that inaccurate, right? When you play Roma Surrectum 2 at that point, like I came from the frustrating experience of the modder that notices these details when you want to work and create something unique. But objectively, when you start Roma Surrectum 2, the first thing that strikes you is how at the beginning of the campaign, this heterogeneity does make a pretty original trait of many units. Right, there is a stupid thing, but I remember, I don't know, there is a, I think it's Cirta in Numidia. You would expect there to see basically all North African units, right? There are, and you know that area was not colonized by the Greeks, but you find, or in the Mediterranean still, there is a Tureophoroi mercenary unit. It's alone, right? You realize that there is some of the modders said, here, I want to see that freaking Tureophoroi unit. And the purpose of it is seeing that the ancient world was constantly traveled by mercenaries, and that in that proportion, in that number, in that is unique for me, for example, to remember now, and to say, you know what, that's actually accurate, right? You start I think it's Battle of Raphia between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies at the beginning of the campaign, and you have, like, I don't know, Libyan spearmen in the Ptolemaic army, you have some Nubian units, the broader Phalanxes is Hellenistic, is Macedonian, but still you realize when facing the Seleucids how different that is, right? You know, how they come from kind of a different background, they have Persian units and stuff. This is all very good when you start the game, right? And it kind of goes well further, but the point is when you come to play this game, you feel so much the embarrassment of the choice of the type of units that are, I don't know, I was just, for making this video yesterday, I was checking the same Seleucid Empire with the capital in Antioch, and look at the roster, recruitment pool, you can recruit, I don't know, like 30 different type of units, and you say, yeah, they are pertinent. They all kind of fit the idea of that unit being possibly there and realistically there and historically there. But that comes to a point in which you almost don't recognize anymore the Seleucid army and national character in the same way. It's true it was a very multicultural army and so, but unavoidably when you're going to make that choice, if there is, for example, a unit that is particularly strong, and you just, want an army of that, you will create every time something new that probably at the time was not really possible of achieving. Like there are the Arabian, Arabian heavy, ultra heavy infantry with the camel or something, and that looks like just the Seleucid Argyraspides. And like if you want to make an army just of that, like who is going to tell you anything? Well, in Europa Barbarorum you can't do that, right? You start with Rome, you just have italic units. Yes, you can find, I don't know, Mauryan mercenaries when you arrive in Sicily from the Carthaginian side, but it ends there. Like you're fighting with Samnites, Lucanians, etc. And it makes you feel that you are within that, and the choice is limited, but also quite within that ethnic pool, still quite varied for you to say, okay, I really feel I'm in Italy now, right? And the same goes for wherever you go, right? And that's the beauty of Europa Barbarorum, that is in this sense, in my opinion, on the longer run, in terms of unit composition, more accurate, more interesting, right? Frankly, I remember playing like as the Romans once back in the day, conquering Spain. Like if you could recruit basically. Another thing about Roma Surrectum 2 is that expanses are tolerable, where you can recruit entire armies. You never ran out of money. They kind of fixed this a little bit, but also in ways that you understand are a bit artificial, because kind of the broader economy is overly pumped. And I realized that with an army made up exclusively of Balearic slingers, I could take out every single damn army that went against me, just by leaving in skirmish mode the units and letting the enemy run in after me, right? And so there is probably, I don't even know whether, because this happens also in Europa Barbarorum a little bit, but it's more evident that you can stick to a single type of unit and kind of tricking the game a little, the artificial intelligence and such. In Europa Barbarorum, instead, you have to provide with a more tactically complete army, right? A more organically complex and balanced force that really needs also, those type of tactical specialties to cooperate synergically with one another and to get the thing done. Another thing, in fact, that I don't like very much of Roma Surrectum 2 is that this mod was, generally speaking, created for the popular use that everybody would like to see, right? You wanted like a bit like the same video games do all the time. Great graphics, spectacular things, etc. It's a beautiful mod, don't get me wrong. I love to play with it as well. But the battles are weird in the sense that because the community complained the battles were too short in Rome Total War, because the units tended to be routed more quickly, right? And they wanted instead to savor a lengthy battle, an intense melee, lasting longer, so that you can even sit there and watch the units from close distance fighting with these beautiful details. The skins of Roma Surrectum 2 are beautiful, even too beautiful. Again, they're all colored, lacquered, and shiny, etc. And sometimes they don't even correspond to what they would, like peasant units with very expensive equipment. You say, well, how, right? This had a cost, right? Europa Barbarorum, kind of that beggar type of average unit is way more accurate, but the actual consequence in Roma Surrectum 2 is that it is the worst, that you really can't route enemy units quickly, right? If you have studied ancient warfare, you can watch the videos I made extensively on these topics and so on. You realize that, yes, battles went on for a long time. This is just a video game. The clash is very short, right, in time. But they were because also maneuvers were complex, right? And, let's say, flanking a phalanx immediately equated for it to break, right? Roma Surrectum 2, this does not exist. Tell you the truth, it doesn't quite exist in Europa Barbarorum as well, but that's an issue I have with phalanxes there that are overpowered. In any case, in Roma Surrectum 2, the problem is always there, that you have entirely surrounded units that go on fighting, even if they are kind of medium type of units, and they will not break, even though at that point every unit would have simply already fled, right? We're not talking about veterans, hardcore troops fighting to the death to save, to save time for the retreat of the other troop. No, this is like an entire battle line, right? In Europa Barbarorum, if you surround the enemy with cavalry, you charge into it, they're gonna break, right? And in Roma Surrectum 2, this is not going to happen. It's just a slow blob of these units sticking together, and it can be spectacular at a point, but it's extremely slow and boring. Plus, you have all the time to carry out very complicated maneuvers that I already explained, being impossible also to be carried out by some units, given the possibilities that the Rome Total War engine gives you. That's true also for Europa Barbarorum. But at least the quicker units route, which of course doesn't have to happen frustratingly, right? There has to be a balance. the better it is, because you have to calculate that the possibility that one section of your line can break easily or unexpectedly, and so the one of the enemy, in a way. So that you have to try this, you have to bet more, right? You have to gamble, which is what effectively all the military business is in practice. Instead, Roma Surrectum 2, you just know that you have to sit there to wear out these guys by sending slingers behind them at 1 meter distance, throwing stones and volleys of stones at a time before they break after having suffered, I don't know, 80% casualty. It's ridiculous, right? And boring. And once you have played one of those battles, it makes you feel like you don't want to play them anymore. Even for that, there is an easy way of fixing it. You can. I was trying that yesterday, halfening, but I didn't have time. Like the moral stats of the units, it would be at that point a much more interesting Roma Surrectum 2. In fact, I was also thinking of, for other reasons, to start another sub-mod of the same, because it would seem really easy to fix what doesn't work. Speaking of the Phalanxes, yes, Europa Barbarorum has a little of a problem there. Phalanxes are, whatever that the modders decided to do, I think they exceeded too much with the concept that every people had very ultra super special things, and maybe the Romans didn't. Right, this is the actual philosophy that I perceived, because this this idea of Europa Barbarorum quisque est barbarus alio, this is the subtitle, is okay, except the Roman units do not perform particularly highly, and they can be routed relatively easily. Whereas if you even surround a Macedonian phalanx, it doesn't break, which is historically incorrect. And even when you attack them from the rear, you surround it, that becomes a bit like a Roma Surrectum 2, and so you have to use a lot of means and, losing a lot of troops that, frankly, the same history of the Manipur Legion versus Macedonian phalanx, about which I made a 2 hours video just to make the point on the broader topic, doesn't suggest at all. So I personally consider it to be a bit realistic. Some say, no, actually it's balanced. Yes, because it's true. I always play very high in the battles, right? I used to play also in very high in the campaign until I realized that the advantages the enemy had were just like, I don't know, they could have double or triple your amount of troops spending the same amount of money. So you realize there is probably a trick, and I didn't like it. And in fact, say the more complex the mod, the more malices you're gonna have from this random factors that are inserted in the game, because the more they are, and altogether collectively, the higher the difficulty, the worse they're gonna go for you, right? So you can't feel that at some point. In fact, frankly, even in the campaign playability, Europa Barbarorum, even at medium difficulty, has some factions that frankly cannot be played. For example, the Saga, that are very interesting faction in the very northeast of the campaign map, are by default in debt economically from the first 2 turns, and there is no way to reverse that. Like there's no way, like, I don't know, I played better those turns, I can conquer another settlement. No, it just goes red, and so there's no way to play it. So it's meant to be difficult for some factions at the beginning, but some are even too much so. And I think Europa Barbarorum is a masterpiece of scripting, because if you actually read the script, it never ends. First of all, it's extremely complex. They use some tricks, some formulas, algorithms that I had never seen in any other mod. So whoever made that was a genius in many ways. But they used all this not, again, to try to make the factions doing something more, expanding, in a historical direction, but setting some triggers that mostly activate some military reforms that occur. There are also scripted historical events, but they're very minor, right? They're not the actual, pack of historical events that would happen in those centuries. It's like very specific, even properly well researched historical notion, but let's say very isolated, a very also unconsequential ones, but that I don't know, the saga even having something to do with conquering Egypt, or it doesn't make any sense, right? At some point, but it's a mystery, and I know that there are players that go digging exactly for that. There are YouTubers even that explain all these things in detail. I personally didn't give a damn, right? I want to play this game. The first thing I want to do is to consolidate my empire, to be sure that nobody attacks me, and or that I can respond to that, and then gathering enough surplus to launch an offensive, an invasion somewhere else, and conquering other territories, and handling that, etc. And with reverses, with defeats, but also continuity. This searching for the mechanism, conquered that city before that date, because who the hell cares? Like, of course, most players don't even read these things, but technically they inserted it, and I think it was just maybe a waste of time. Like, surely for those who get interested, maybe it's great, but I think for the average player, what you want to see is, again, the world taking the shape of times, right? And this doesn't happen, unfortunately. Is there some specific historical inaccuracy? Speaking of the units, yes, there are, but I think they are, in part they're forgivable, in part not. This is true both for Europa Barbarorum and Roma Surrectum too. For example, and this is the worst one, both mods represent mercenary phalanges, meaning properly mercenary pikemen phalanxes of the Macedonian Hellenistic type, which is something that actually I am aware of. I think the only exception in the ancient world is one unit in the Battle of Raphia, and we're not even told whether they actually were equipped like that. They just had been phalanges that had eventually served as mercenaries, but we don't know whether the same equipment. For the rest, in the ancient world, there is no such thing anywhere like mercenary units of pikemen in the phalangitic form. There is none of that. Both Europa Barbarorum and Roma Surrectum 2 are full of this. Actually, it's one of the most common mercenary unit types everywhere, right from North Africa to the Middle East, right? You find them everywhere because these are supposed to be, I don't know, remnants of Hellenistic troops scattered right, in North Africa, by the way. I can understand, as generally speaking, yes, there are still, here it's in the moment of peak of the Seleucids, of the Ptolemies, of the Antigonids, but, those had their own colonists that were also settled exactly to have the means to provide with the enormous costs that the phalanx entailed in equipment. In general, it was something atrocious. Just making the Sarissa would cost an enormous lot. For not talking about training them and having this professional force available, it was a great problem in general. Instead, you find them everywhere, and part of the reason, I think, let's say the two mods had different philosophies and minds behind that. In my opinion, in Europa Barbarorum, what they wanted to do, as I said before, is to overemphasize how developed or hypertrophic military cultures, non-Roman military cultures were, as opposed to the Romans. Right? There is this slight, I can say, anti-Roman bias, but something that tells, look, there's the special unit card, as we will see it now, even with other units somewhere else that are actually inaccurate, but I think I still like them. They're plausible, as long as they're well balanced as units in combat. In Roma Surrectum 2, they just wanted to represent, in my opinion, every culture in a kind of that's a more probably a strictly historical mistake, right? It's in both cases, but let's say the Hellenic/Hellenistic world in Roma Surrectum 2 is hypertrophic. They have everything. They gave every single unit.
oh come on, they even inserted Sparta, which is ridiculous. We'll talk about the factions at that time. And so they wanted to represent for every area kind of the most strange kind of variation or, extra unit in the roster to say, okay, they counted, they have it. As I was saying before, this ended up to dilute the uniqueness of the same fact. And you can find this damn mercenary pikemen everywhere scattered the whole world. By the way, I stress this as a very common unit. I think not even the Turiophoroi are present in the same way, that were instead literally everywhere, but also not maybe in the say typical Hellenic kind of custom. Turiophoroi were basically also throwaway troops from all these other probably barbarian populations all around. I made a video about the Turiophoroi, but we'll keep talking about that. That's, in my opinion, the actual worst, because it's a just big misconception about ancient warfare and probably what the Macedonian phalanx stemmed from as a political social system, and you could not find that type of unit in the world scattered, like roaming as a mercenary band, right? Also because in order to be effective, phalanxes have to be pretty large, right? So these single units, being integrated in other systems, there is no historical trace or evidence of that. It simply didn't work like that, right? And because they were national armies, they didn't work with this kind of, okay, let's go abroad being effective, like just the difference with the Swiss in late medieval times, which, the two phalanxes were very different. There can't be an equation, but that the Switzerland contracted entire armies, entire contingents. There is none of this in the Hellenistic Diadochoi powers, right? Another thing connected to this is that I remember about Roma Surrectum too, which I think doesn't make this mistake. But Europa Barbarorum goes far as far as providing with, in the evolutionary, let's say, extreme of development of certain military cultures, specifically the Punic Carthaginian one, the Hellenistic phalanx. There is, I don't remember how it's called, maybe even properly in a Greek term, agema, for the same. No, I don't think so. There is, I remember now, there is in North Africa, I think, some Libyan phalanx with properly this like a phalangitic pikeman one. But then in Carthage, basically the top Carthaginian infantry would have developed from, let's say, a Carthaginian empire not crushed by Rome, that by 270 BC was still plausible, a phalanx, right? So essentially making this logical connection, that is, if other cultures had prevailed in the Mediterranean, surely they would have adopted the phalanx. The Macedonian type of phalanx was something similar. Frankly, that's also pretty weird, because no other people did that, unless they were heavily kind of Hellenized. I'm talking about Pontus just, and that's an exception. And we also don't know about that Rediviv, that was a Chironeia against Sulla, if I'm not wrong, but we have extremely scarce evidence, and that's the only one after the end of the Diadochoi that also kind of didn't deploy really the phalanx, because it costed too much, especially in the moment of their decline. Talking about the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies also abandoned it much earlier as well. Why would the Carthaginians would have adopted that? Right, before some genius arrives and said, "Oh, because Xanthippus of Sparta taught the Carthaginians how to the Greek model." That's another myth. It's absolutely not true. There is no evidence of that. There is no evidence of any kind of reform happening at the time on that basis, and especially on the Hellenistic one. There is no evidence of any kind of phalanx of Hellenistic Macedonian style used by the Carthaginians. This is a mistake that happened iconographically in the modern reconstructions, since Connolly, that mistranslated from the Loeb translator without knowing Greek, long K in pike, which is not the case. It's a javelin. So he exchanged the lengths, also partly throwing lengths of the Libyan spearmen as a sort of phalanx, and everybody, as idiots, followed by the way. And so, but there is no evidence, and this is very famous for any person who has studied actually Carthaginian warfare, and you can easily check that was never anything even remotely like an Hellenistic. It was unique to the Macedonian successor states. There is none of that elsewhere. And also Xanthippus just was like a professional who maybe drilled the troops better before the battle against the Romans, like back in the day. There's nothing to do with the adoption of Hellenistic warfare. This is complete bullshit. It has nothing to do with anything. And people still confuse Hellenism as a form of, mechanical, technological kind of tactics, and not as a concept in the art of war that Carthaginians surely absorbed, but not by copying the army, but using simply what they had in a combined arms fashion, even actually surpassing the same Hellenistic model with Hannibal himself, which also the Romans learned in turn. But this has zero, completely nothing to do with any adoption of units, military organization, weapons, and frankly, the best indicator of a person that absolutely doesn't know anything and just has a video game-based culture on these topics is exactly the people who state these kind of things, because these are the bullshits that they heard somewhere on a forum and they thought were true, and they never had any mean to verify that, nor in the sources, nor in the studies, in the actual history, military history more specifically. But I'm not going to digress on this. I'm just stating today that it's a big mistake, and it's a conceptual one that didn't help. Probably there are people who think this exactly because of what they saw, for example, in Europa Barbarorum. The reason, again, being, look, I think Europa Barbarorum was a bit ideological. Look, there was another military system that the others had and that eventually the Romans destroyed. So, but look at how cool and developed it was and which peaks it would reach. No, right? I personally think that, if the Carthaginians had won over Rome, they would have simply developed a very similar system to the one they already had, first of all, but concentrating on that kind of type of average medium infantrymen they could find everywhere from Italy to Spain or Gaul, and that they regularly employed, and it was basically the standard of any kind of trooper in the ancient world. Aside from this, maybe just the Macedonian phalanx, it was unique in its own kind. There was no need for creating that model equal in the same way. Also because it was a different mindset. It was a different political and social system, right? There was no way things would evolve like that. We have no historical hint things were evolving that way. If you're searching, I think was Polybius saying that the Macedonians sent at Zama a unit of pikemen. Well, it's quite unlikely considering how the Macedonian finances were reduced at that time. Also, we don't have a trace in the accounts, but also, and I think it's Livy actually that says that. But it's not important. There were also a few, and so the Carthaginian army didn't make any difference, and it's probably not real. In any case, the soft bias has remained. Again, everybody has the special, cool, hypertrophic kind of super units, except the Romans, right? That for some reason in Europa Barbarorum. The same goes for other types of units that are completely invented. For example, but that are plausible. And in this, instead, I like Europa Barbarorum because, for example, the double-handed swords. There are some units from Central Europe, from Britain, etc. that have them. Now, we don't have basically any evidence of this either for the ancient world. Such technology costed probably a lot, was ineffective, inefficient in terms of cost-benefit ratios. But still, it's possible. Like, after all, double-handed swords appear somewhere, and one-and-a-half swords as well. We have, in the High Middle Ages, not everything is clear, so it's definitely possible there was some warrior who had this kind of weapons, maybe, especially those affected by giantism, given that, weapons were kind of adapted to the body capacity. But still, it's a unit, it's a rare unit, it doesn't appear often. It's a bit like the ultra elite you can find in those places, and why not, right? There are other I don't know. Yes, there is something else, like in Europa Barbarorum, that you realize that is not witnessed historically, that there is no evidence of, right? Certain goidelic units, certain ultra heavy ones, but they're plausible because at the end of the day, we know that elite existed. We know that it was plausible, after all, for such armor to be around. And so I think those adaptations are actually good, right? And I checked back in the day. Exactly the realism on this unit. There was somebody complaining, and I remember some of Europa Barbarorum creators, modders said, you know what? Yes, this thing did not exist, and they didn't want to say it out loud. But yes, it's still plausible and it's okay. Well, yeah, for a video game, I think it's okay. Right, I think that it's plausible. It adds some form of of thrill, and so it doesn't hurt, right? And so if you want to be extra picky about things, unless it's the the mercenary phalange pikeman, let it go, because it's not that important. Can't remember of other specific mistakes, but yeah, there are this kind of things happening. While in Roma Surrectum 2, I don't remember atrocious mistakes. Actually, I think that in representing all that kind of medium type of, say, infantries that existed, especially in the Hellenistic era, and a bit also in the aforementioned dispersonalizing Central European reality, after all, Roma Surrectum 2 made a good job, right? Like giving the impression of this umpteenth type of medium unit that you will not even remember, but that makes mass and that looks plausible in some way, coming from somewhere. And it's exactly that hypertrophic mix connected with this instead enormous amount of building tree possibilities and loss of money all around. It makes a bit the thing, right? I remember that I never played much Roma Surrectum 2 because I decided one time to recreate some kind of historical progress. I was playing with the Romans, and the file saving the campaign was so heavy, was so loaded in information, and I think it's my computer. It's the game that didn't support it. Right, it couldn't re-upload the campaign because the file surpassed the maximum size that the game could support. So there was so many units, so many in a single campaign, because you're ultra rich and you have all these units around, that not even the game can sustain that. And so I think it was too much, right? You can probably mod successfully Roma Surrectum 2 for making it better, but I didn't see any effort. Yeah, they reduced that, specifically the money especially, but that kind of messy, uncontrollable, development of factions, really not. But for the rest, both mods have actually very good units. As I was saying before, the impression is that Roma Surrectum 2's ones are too shiny, too elite, too cool looking for being habitual units you would see on the field, but they wanted to make it more spectacular than else at some levels. So you gotta understand them in part, and it doesn't look bad after all. Again, it makes the thing. It makes that complexity. It makes that variety, and yeah, why not? You can it's nice because after all, one thing they nailed instead is that you can record, since the beginning of the campaign, basically all the range of troops, which is what I'm using in my submod too as a concept, because in in Europa Barbarorum instead you have to wait like for the settlements to grow to have the ultra elite troops, and instead, like in a normal culture, you should have them already available, right? So this is a bit the ambiguity that the same game mechanics brings since the earlier game, but there are ways to mod it quite easily, and so and adding other bonuses or improvements and so on. I'm personally, however, for the kind of the low experience standard units in the game. If I'm not wrong, Roma Surrectum 2 has units with a lot of experience normally available. Structurally, meaning that you recruit, I don't know, certain specific Roman units or whatever, like especially of your ethnic pool, and immediately have 6 kind of 3 silver chevrons. That is, ultra veteran at that point, for nothing, right? Instead, I like more Europa Barbarorum because it doesn't indulge in bonuses. You just recruit troops that have maybe 1 or 2 bronze, chevrons at best, and you send them into battle. And so the difference between the veteran troops that have fought lots of wars will mature over time. It will be more evident, right? You can make more of a difference in the field. Whereas in Roma Surrectum 2, yes, it's cool that you have all unit types available from the top structures in the capitals and so on, but at the same time, too much experience, right? It's too... you're not amazed by saying, wow, look at this unit, how much experience it gained throughout all the fights and so on. The exception being maybe just the mercenaries, that at least are more experienced troops who just recruit them. In fact, what I like in Europa Barbarorum is that mercenaries cost a lot, really a lot, compared to all the rest. Maybe even too much in perspective, but they at least also show you that poverty. Like, it's true that there were lots of mercenaries in the ancient world, etc., but even that world was pretty rough and wild. And it's not that you had, lots of people from everywhere all the time, right? So instead, in Roma Surrectum 2, it's full of mercenaries everywhere all the time, just like in the same way. Well, a bit, maybe not overwhelmingly, but surely more than that and surely at better prices than in Europa Barbarorum. So this is an important difference, the experience, right? Speaking of surely I will think of something more strictly military now, will come up in my mind. Yes, there are minor things. For example, I don't know, Roma Surrectum 2's artillery, I think, is more historically accurate than Europa Barbarorum's, but it's just a few things. After all, artillery shouldn't be so central. I like how much it costs in Europa Barbarorum. It's a huge cost, also logistically. It's impressive. Instead, again, in Roma Surrectum 2, everything is relatively easy. Another very important chapter are the factions, because the faction choice naturally influences much what you eventually are going to see in the game. As I was saying before, Europa Barbarorum makes good choices for the type of map that it has. It has very interesting kind of exotic units like factions such as the aforementioned Saka, the Sabans in Arabia, the Bactrians. You have also, it's interesting to have 2 Gallic factions in Europa Barbarorum. There isn't much in North Africa though, right? There are nor Numidians nor other factions around. Some are depicted, interestingly enough. There are Garamantian units, there are lots of Nubian units, but the Horn of Africa doesn't have everything there. There are no Scythians. There are just the Sarmatians and the Saka in the steppes. It's kind of okay. There are no Thracians. There are, let's say, it's an interesting balance. I would say the Near East is fine, like the Adochoi are finely balanced, etc. And all in all, they're okay. Like, I remember somebody complaining, I don't want to see the Britons, even if I'm British myself, in Europa Barbarorum, because the Britons were not so relevant. Yeah, well, yeah, you can argue that. I mean, they weren't like an incisive people altogether, but that area of the map is at least it's covered. Let's not underestimate also kind of barbarian peoples, because they were something that also were somewhat more complex than we think. Instead, I'm more dissatisfied with Roma Surrectum 2's choices, because the map is smaller, and one advantage the mod has over Europa Barbarorum is actually that there is a Roman rebel faction, which enables the possibility of civil wars among the Romans, which I think are very beautiful to see and play, even though the campaign is always messed up when it happens and there are crashes and things. Often it's not easy to balance that. So in Europa Barbarorum, you just have the Roman faction and nothing happens. There are never civil wars, no disruptions, etc. It's okay. Like, after all, civil wars happen in every faction, every time, historically. Just they can be simulated in different ways. It's just that with Rome, you have objectively, by the time the civil wars broke out in the late Republic, like massive parts of Europe against massive, and Europe Mediterranean against one another, and so simulating that is not so bad, and so at least they have that. Also, Roma Surrectum 2 actually has another positive thing, that next to the rebels has another kind of shadow faction. I don't even know whether it's accurate to call it like this. It's basically another rebel faction, but at least that has an initiative, because the rebels normally have initiatives just if you provoke them or something. This one instead is just like another faction, very active, but it's scattered all over the map, and it functions exactly like the rebels, and it's a pain in the behind very often. And I think it was a good idea, because in the rebels are too passive normally, so being at war with these guys is like, you don't see much the difference with the rebels, because they have the same black color right in the map, etc. But it makes you see that these other populations are aggressive, and so you're not, you just don't say, like in Europa Barbarorum, okay, I'm a German, I'm isolated from the others, there's no enemy bordering me, I can expand peacefully. No, the rebels should pose some sort of obstacle, and even threatening you at some level. So I like this in Roma Surrectum 2. What I don't like of Roma Surrectum 2 is that they, I think, that I tell you the reasons. Sparta, right? That's ridiculous. They wanted to make, because of popular obsession with 300 and everything, they had to make in the cool mod for the kids Sparta. That at the time was just a minor power, factually didn't count much, and there were at least many other powers that were more important than it, that are not, of course, represented. It's even a cool faction, actually, from a historical point of view, because it's very well, the Roma Surrectum 2 roster historically is very well researched, and aesthetically it looks impressive. But come on, Sparta, come on. You could do it just as it's normal, like in Europa Barbarorum. Sparta actually is part of a sort of the Koinon and Lenon, which is this kind of not better specified Hellenic league, and it has, I think, just it's the Spartiates as a characteristic unit. Here you have a full faction, which also takes away units from the roster, etc., from the model slots, etc., that just stays there, and even sometimes takes over the entire thing. So it's ridiculous. The other thing they could have thought better is they added practically a Celtic faction that is the boy one in Central Europe. Now, it's true that that area is normally empty since Vanilla, right? In Europa Barbarorum, since really nothing happens around those Central European areas, they made a very heavy scripting system for which nobody should expand there, because they made a script that basically always generates new garrisons in the area so that nobody conquers it, and with an overwhelming amount of experience bonuses for the troops. And so, because normally this is a problem actually with all Rome Total War mods, that Rome from Italy always tend to expand towards Central Europe, right? It doesn't take the rest of the Mediterranean. So I try to script that heavily, and it works by a certain degree, but the more powerful it becomes, the more it will tend to go there. So I want to import the same script type from Europa Barbarorum. It's also very simple and effective in that. And so nobody gets there. In fact, Europa Barbarorum beautifully, at least in terms of broader world balance, makes it happen that nobody invades Central Europe. Nobody goes there, right? It's a bit of, settlements lost, and I remember once in my mega campaigns with Rome to take over those places. But the troops are so overpowered that you can't send lots of Roman legions that will be destroyed. But I finally managed to conquer at least all the Danubian area, because that's what I wanted to do. And it's the only area of the map that is huge, as I said, in which they needed to do this, because even Italy were frustrated themselves by that specific phenomenon that ruins always the game. That was the only thing that they decided to balance more accurately, and that objectively is the most important for any mod, I can tell you. But there are also other things. Instead, in Roma Surrectum 2, they added the boy, which, as many Celtic peoples actually have different settlements scattered across Europe, specifically, in that case, they have, like, Bohemia, fundamentally, from which, in fact, the region takes historically name after the Celtic people. And then the area of Bononia, right? So in Cisalpine Gaul, that also, in fact, takes the name from the boy. And so, like, it was not a bad idea conceptually. Right? You have, yes, this people that has both Central European and Northern Italian land can pose a minimal obstacle to Rome after the Second Punic War, while recovering Cisalpine Gaul that, as you know, the Carthaginians had kind of made rebel again. Yeah, but altogether, like, it's not that the Boii are a faction that we remember historically for any specific reason, right? They weren't like a particularly military distinctive people. We can appreciate the fact that they migrated in Gaul orderly later times. As you know, they were pressured, destroyed by the Germans later on. That the area was occupied by the Marcomanni, etc. So yeah, it's interesting because it brings also that kind of Germanic versus Celtic struggle in Central Europe, but too many Celtic factions. Like, you have the Boii, you have the Aedui, then you have the Belgians. The Aedui and the Belgians are fine. It's basically like Europa Barbarorum a little. In Europa Barbarorum, you have the Aedui and the Arverni. In Roma Surrectum 2, you have the Arverni, actually, and the Belgians. And I like that because the Belgians basically become also the British faction, because they have a foothold, in fact, historically was in southern Britain, whereas in Europa Barbarorum, the Brittonic faction, the Casa, is just, an insular power. So I liked the Belgian choice, I liked the Arverni, but the Boii were perhaps not so necessary, especially in a mod like that. You may want to see the Numidians or the Thracians, right? Maybe the Balkans with the Thracians become a bit too crowded. Maybe, the Numidians were important for Roman history and all, but they were not such an enormously relevant people together. I agree, but surely they were more than the Boii, right? And in fact, Roma Surrectum 2 basically excludes some areas from within even the more restricted map of Europa Barbarorum. For example, if I'm not wrong, Ireland, Hibernia is not represented. There is, but you can't go there. Also, North Africa, basically the North African hinterland is not represented. Instead, in Europa Barbarorum, that also doesn't have, basically, as we were saying before, any North African faction except Carthage, still has a North African hinterland, still has important ethnic units such as the Roma Surrectum 2 has the Numidian ones, but say there were the Maori, there were the Garamantians. There is really nothing of that. So I'm not particularly thrilled about that choice. Interesting are also the Galeci, telling you the truth. They decided to represent the Iberian faction as actually a Celtic one in the far north. In Roma Surrectum 2 is yet another Celtic faction in practice. In Europa Barbarorum, they were a bit more original. They had the Lusotanen, so they were nor Celtic nor Iberians, but fundamentally this other distinct Indo-European branch in the far west of the map that, oddly enough, take over all Iberian Gaul in Italy. And so, as I was saying at the very beginning of the video, these mods are not balanced at all, right? And they are ridiculous. But at least, like, as a choice, they are okay. And what they inserted in Roma Surrectum 2 is also Pergamon, which, as you know, they were Roman allies against the Seleucids. They tried to, to stay alive, but Rome eventually, occupied them. Is Pergamon necessary as a faction? Okay, we are at the level of maybe of those who were not represented elsewhere, like the Numidians, like maybe even the boy at some level. But I don't know. And the idea of Roma Surrectum 2 there instead is that they wanted to content the fans of some specific cultural areas. Like, while Europa Barbarorum tends to say, okay, Rome is not the center of the world. That's the meaning of the mob. Roma Surrectum 2 says, yeah, Rome is like the coolest thing ever, and it's very well represented and all. But then we want to represent also the fans of 300 with Sparta and all the Hellenistic pack, which has to be there overwhelmingly pictured. And then also the Celtic world, because there are lots of people that like the Celtic world. They want to take their revenge on Rome, and so Celticism and everywhere, right? With basically 4 Celtic factions. And no Numidians, no Thracians. I'm not a huge fan of that, right? I thought that also this hypertrophic Hellenism that you find everywhere with the damned mercenary, pikemen that I can't stand, could be reduced a little bit. But it's true also that Roma Surrectum 2 is a more, Mediterranean-based map, and so, like, at the end of the day, Hellenistic culture was dominating, so it's kind of okay, but it's as if they had compartmentalized the various areas, right? But Roma Surrectum 2 again tends to always make this kind of fireworks. Like, the Germans are, decently represented, but they're a bit too undistinguishable from the Celts, which actually is something that I sometimes say myself, speaking of military cultures. But at least, I don't know, in Europa Barbarorum it really feels like to be among Germanic tribes if you play with the Suebi faction. There it's like all a mix. You can't even tell there are Celtic units scattered everywhere. Again, it's blended. We can't even distinguish properly at some level who was Celt and who was German. And as you know, these were 2 ethnographic inventions of the classical world. They're just different shades of Indo-European, like the same Romans, the Italics, were other peoples, were the Dacians. The Dacians also had that kind of bias, but you see, they're not represented like that in Roma Surrectum 2. You have a more distinctively kind of Dacian culture, whereas in Europa Barbarorum you see that there is much more Celtic stuff around the Danube, which I think it was very well done. There is 2 in Roma Surrectum 2, but in Europa Barbarorum is kind of heavier. In fact, I think that Europa Barbarorum actually represents better the broader Celtic world compared to other areas. It doesn't indulge too much on it. It represents it as it was. It doesn't romanticize it. It doesn't hyperpower it in some ways, like even Roma Surrectum 2 does. It doesn't equate them, right, as others do. But it represents it well in its entirety, with its shades, with its differences, because actually, again, what is Celtic? It's difficult to answer to historically, just, if anybody knows the history and the archaeology of it. And so, yeah, I guess it's kind of better. In fact, also speaking of the broader balance between military capacities of the various factions, I think that even though the Romans, as I was saying, in Europa Barbarorum are slightly underpowered, in my opinion, still you do get a fair depiction of what the average, in spite of some invented cool units, as I was saying before, that again are plausible in that context, the average army was made up of, right? And it's terribly unromantic, but at the same time romantic exactly because it's that brutally primitive and archaic and poor, and so it does really make you feel the effort of those people. In Roma Surrectum 2, instead, the impression is that everybody's rich, everybody's kind of alike, everybody is kind of, this kind of relativistic mode of saying, yeah, well, why can't the Germans have catapults in this age, or I don't know, that doesn't even happen in the mod, if I'm not wrong, but I think it's possible at some point. I don't remember, I've never seen what happens when they conquered more civilized regions. In Rome 2, that was standard, they could build it, which is historically inaccurate. But because it just didn't fit the world. I mean, it's not that again, artillery or technology made the thing, right? It was very much not that. But in general, like in Roma Surrectum 2, you have, for example, the building trees are all maximized and kind of in parallelly developed for each faction. Like every faction arrives to Metropolis has the equivalent of Roman aqueducts everywhere, like even in the barbarian world, maybe except for the nomadic culture that they inserted. But instead, in Europa Barbarorum, you really feel how primitive and, undeveloped the barbarian cultures are, and that they just can't build larger settlements, and they concentrate more on some other aspects, let's say, that also make them terrible foes, right? They like how difficult it is to defeat them, some of them in the battlefield, but again, it's very rare to find elite units there, whereas elite units are present very much in Roma Surrectum 2, and that doesn't sound quite right because they costed a lot. Even the most developed factions, civilizations, really had a lot of trouble in putting on the field a consistent amount of troops. So I think that there is a quite relevant amount of things to consider when you play these mods, and the effect that they can have in a person's historical perspective. What else to say? Well, I don't know. I don't think that these mods actually created problems. If anything, I think that thanks to them, lots of people just began to know more or less what ancient warfare was about, right? And you would be surprised by how powerful these mods are, how much they open your eyes, and they give you properly a visual dimension of how certain things could be. Some units are very well done. I mean, if you look at Roma Surrectum 2 Libyan Spearmen, they're, the Libo-Phoenician Spearmen are very well, neatly done. The same Roman. There are some tactical, some historical insights. For example, even the details of the models are much better. The models are larger than Europa Barbarorum, because a few people know it, but the models have a different type of size, right? If you bring a Roman legionnaire in Europa Barbarorum, it looks like a giant, because they use another model, literally. But in that way, you can see how more detailed they are, right, in customs, equipment, etc. So Roma Surrectum 2 attracts you because it gives you this greater scale of detail with bigger units physically, and they're very, very, very well accurate. Europa Barbarorum gives you that feeling of everybody kind of looks, coming from a very tough world where resources cost, right? That's the feeling that gives you really. But it gives you also an atmosphere, it gives you some deeper cultural insight about the shades that these cultures could have without blending them into like something you can't quite distinguish, especially as the campaign goes on. Because the problem is always the campaign. Like if you want to play a battle, first of all, well, even there, you see, this can be a problem for kids that play it, that in Roma Surrectum 2 you have, I think, everything is mixed. Like if you want to play a battle, you'll never, I think, have a roster with just the ethnic troops or the one of the surroundings for a single faction. In Europa Barbarorum, you have different type. If I'm not wrong, on a single player, you can't play just what the ethnic properly background is. We have mercenaries, but only from the areas from which more or less these peoples dwelt. So it's kind of, even in there, it's kind of more compact. But especially during the campaign, and especially in Roma Surrectum 2, things tend to get mixed dramatically. Like, again, in these mods, it was a problem also for Rome. You will never find randomly a complete, an organically complete Roman legion appear magically from the artificial intelligence. You will not. Alright, so it's somewhat frustrating, and that's why I think that scripting is the only way to fix certain things. But even that should be done carefully and in detail, and without making the campaign too heavy or too overloaded, and just making you see some turning points that are important, and making you playing them and see what happens, and maybe changing a big deal, right? But everything should be delicate and very well calibrated, and in this I think Europa Barbarorum comes the closest to, right? And it would have been a great mod to mod in itself if, and I tried, the script didn't work if you touch anything of it. That is, even if you want to delete a certain part of it. I have a pretty advanced experience with scripting. That thing doesn't start if you touch it. I don't know why. It seems the file is weird. I don't know. I don't know why it happens, honestly. Whereas Roma Surrectum 2 script is much simpler. I think it can be modded easily, and I have created a pretty massively loaded historical script with the actual campaigns and battles taking place. But I can't insert it in Europa Barbarorum, and I didn't try in Roma Surrectum 2 because I think Roma Surrectum 2 is too unbalanced for the type of balance that I'm searching. But in my submod, I'm working with it. For the rest, I don't know. As I was saying before, speaking of the Roman legionnaires, in Roma Surrectum 2, they are actually a steamroller. They tend to defeat basically almost anyone. They're not undefeatable. They're not, let's say, they take losses, etc. But let's say they tend to again be very good at melee. Instead, in Europa Barbarorum, I think they tend to lose too easily in a way, and especially again against the Phalanx, there is no way to break through in conditions of parity, for which even there you have to script certain specific things. But again, these are things you should feel during a campaign, right? If the campaign flows and you don't notice these things, it's okay. If you start fighting battles because you realize that in campaign you saw something that doesn't really seem right, it's not working. And I stress the fact that they're not even badly balanced. I mean, even in Europa Barbarorum, I want to lose if I play with the Romans. I want to be crushed. But at the same time, I don't want to get around a medium quality phalanx unit, charging it and not seeing it breaking, but actually, it inflicting me losses in hand-to-hand combat against legionnaires, because that's really not historical. You can make the point that maybe, yes, we have underestimated maybe the individual phalangite hand-to-hand capability, the fact that some of these guys were recruited from areas that were still somewhat warlike. In fact, that's very interesting. That's a shade that you see, that some of these, for example, Middle Eastern phalangites have some axes as side weapons, etc. So those are cool, but again, we don't have historical evidence that the phalanx had in the single units that capacity of resistance. On the contrary, as soon as it broke, entirely. I mean, and I wouldn't like to see exactly that either, because I should again, but that's the point, that not even the artificial intelligence in the field presents you with, right? That is an entire line of pikemen that march orderly, drilled without breaking. In a Roman Total War battle is practically impossible to see, right? And so actually the submod I have goes pretty close to that, but still it's very difficult to make it work, because I imported in my submod actually Europa Barbarorum stats, unit stats that are the ones that I like the most in absolute terms. and that fit my taste as more type of battle. I couldn't again work on that slow mid grinder of Roma Surrectum 2. It's too boring, it's too long, it's too uneventful, right? And rather than stimulating tactical capacities, actually just, teaches you how to cheat against an enemy that just sits there before getting, that you can't pin down and surround. The other issue with the Roman legionnaires that you have that maybe is not entirely a problem per se is that even though in Europa Barbarorum there are military reforms, also for the Romans, the actual change between legionnaires doesn't really happen, right? While it's true that the average Roman legionnaire of modern times, etc., was modeled on the princeps, and that it is true, yes, that not even in Augustan times there were actual important additions to Roman, say to the Roman legionnaire equipment. It was pretty much the same. Still, the unit stats of all, like the princeps, the Marian legionnaire, and the Augustan legionnaire, are identical, right? So you don't feel that this thing has progress. Basically, you have reforms mostly for the auxiliaries, and the Roman legions do not change. They change in look, but they don't change in essence, right? So it's as easy to take down an Augustan legionnaire as much as it is like a princeps of Polybian times. So that is something that didn't fully stimulate, nor there is much properly imperial development. There is no unit with the so-called segmented armor, for example, whereas in Roma Surrectum 2 there is the full pack, because in theory Europa Barbarorum finishes in 14 AD, whereas Roma Surrectum 2 is meant to go beyond with Rome properly in having units, imperial units, even too early, frankly. I remember at least the 2.5 version of the mod made you have like legionnaires with segmented armor in, I don't know, at the end of the 1st century BC with the actual historical legions. I don't remember why, but I remember they still had to fix the reform system. They basically didn't have the Marian reform in between. Like they, like when it started the Imperial one altogether, so they had to fix it. And I mean, it's not a big deal, but at least, let's say, once it's fixed in Roma Surrectum 2, you have the impression that those legionnaires have become bulkier and more professional and more effective on the field. Whereas in Europa Barbarorum, you don't have that feeling. I personally don't mind that much. Like, what I mind is just having a fair balance in combat. And the only thing that pisses me off is those Macedonian, is that overpowering properly the Macedonian phalanx that others have pointed out, right? In the entire game mechanic that, messes up a bit things. Because whereas the rest is kind of acceptable, right? Even in the strange kind of more elite units that appear sometimes, you may wonder the historicity of, but they're still plausible. That's the only thing. Whereas, yeah, I think it's fair to say, yes, that the average Roman legionnaire was taken individually as like the average type of trooper, like just really better equipped in starting from Middle Republican times, but let's say because there was a state behind it, but fundamentally it was the collective training and the professionalism, cohesion, and that made of the Roman army that a radically morally superior system that could make the things that it would, right? But it's difficult to represent that in a game that is just about some bots that are beating each other, right? So, but there are ways, again, with modding that fixes that. But again, this is not what we're discussing in theory today. Sure, there are lots of other things to talk about. Roma Surrectum 2 is, visually pleasant in more instances than Europa Barbarorum, right? Aesthetically, they made a great job, also probably with the panels, with the art of the unit cards, with the strategic map, the nature of it from above. but again, you say wow, but then when you have to play, it's another story, right? You're looking at other things, what the game mechanics is fundamentally, and so it's a different thing altogether. But in general, yeah, this is the impression that I got from these mods, and I advise you to play them if you ever get Rome. You can download them, and again, I don't have much time to play them again, but considering the amount of time I spent back in the day playing these things, like, was cool. I must say, in terms of campaign gameplay, I think Europa Barbarorum is the best in the first, like in the first part of the, say, in the first 100, 200 turns, perhaps, because it's the expansional phase, especially of Rome, is in other factions, is very well represented. So if you want to take over the world in that time span, it's perfect. It's really represented in probably in the best way a mod has ever done. I remember some campaigns, some enforced, like logistically speaking, it's very challenging if you haven't clear ideas on what to do. Everything costs a lot, etc. Roma Surrectum 2, I couldn't play it for long because it overflowed, and I tended also to remain stuck to my board boundaries, not to because I didn't feel challenged enough also by the other factions. So instead, Europa Barbarorum is a more regulated campaign that makes you, say, after all, wanting to expand toward the directions that you need, where you can choose whether to, I don't know, going for the Mediterranean, as it should be obvious as a Roman, for example, rather than immediately Gaul, right? But how do you cope with Spain, for example, and the Carthaginian threat? I'm lucky that I have, in my submod, a 202 BC map where the Romans already have the Spanish Mediterranean coast, and so I can also script involving them more in Greece and in Spain, so that the faction will not be distracted. But you also want to represent the need to invade the richer lands, the ports, the urbanized areas of the Mediterranean. And so, as a player, you should be wanting to do that. If a mod brings you to say, okay, it's completely indifferent to me, well, it's never completely indifferent, but let's say there's not so much difference. Well, probably because they wanted you not to care that much. And Roma Surrectum 2 has a bit that philosophy, but I presume that with all the complaints and all the things, that they changed it for the better. They also, I've seen they included some terrific monuments. Actually don't like that idea either. Like there is an idea that Rome or other cities they have this fixed plan, city plan, for which even if these same cities evolve towards higher levels, they remain always the same, whereas normally they change. They have ever larger settlement plans, but since here there are the monuments, they didn't at least create something more complex. And definitely they don't represent the actual plan of the ancient city. So that's, again, another aesthetical, graphical, visual thing that goes over history, that steps over history without consent. Another thing that I can't stand is in Roma Surrectum 2, the Celtic oppida that they represented, which was a good idea after all, because no mod really ever represented very well the Central European oppida in their fortified. I mean, yeah, since Vanilla there is something like that for the Celts, this kind of more elevated settlements with multiple levels, etc. In Roma Surrectum 2, again, they made perhaps the most beautiful oppidum ever as a model, but it never changes. Or it does, but it remains, like, for some levels the same. And plus, the troops that come out of it, since the settlement is so kind of irregular, they often disrupt the unit. The soldiers lag behind. They don't deploy in time when there are sorties, like this kind of thing. So, was that necessary? And even, an oppidum would be very beautiful to represent, but there are just a few houses after all. And again, they were not cities. They were oppida, but I mean, they maybe could do better, rather than saying, okay, we just have to do the new thing that looks cool, right? Just think of how that integrates in the actual gameplay, because otherwise nobody's going to care more than much. But again, I've been perhaps harsh towards Roma Surrectum 2, that actually loved that as well, and it's not even that I can't even wholeheartedly say that I love Europa Barbarorum evidently more than Roma Surrectum 2. It's just a different type of experience, right? And it's surely unique in its own kind. There are some things Roma Surrectum 2 is better at, other things that are, even in gameplay properly, that also Europa Barbarorum doesn't have. And that's pretty much it. Like, if I had to have an ideal mod, I would probably have, like, for landscape, something closer to Rome Vanilla, but maybe with some kind of, fixing for the trees, etc. Like a Roma Surrectum 2 strategic map and panels, etc. And probably, in fact, Europa Barbarorum's units that are terrific, fantastic. Maybe if with a smaller map you would manage to fit the historical, some historical Roman legions altogether, because there are less slots used for other cultures, units in the broader map. Those are beautiful, and I would insert the Numidians and the Thracians, frankly, over the Spartans and Pergamon or the Boy, let's say. But the rest of the ideas are not bad, and altogether, you can always modify these things. We didn't talk about the traits, for example, that are an important thing. I think even in there, it's the same story. Europa Barbarorum has fewer, but probably more correct and less impacting traits. Roma Surrectum 2 is much more complicated, in a sense much more interesting, but it's also maybe too incisive and overloaded, and also maybe doesn't characterize say characters, in fact, more than much, right? I like, however, both systems are very complex. There are different careers, statuses, there is age. Those things are very difficult also to mod, to insert, and in any case, like, they work on the basic also traits system of Rome Total War that is pretty good for starting modding again. That's all I can think, honestly, for today. But if you have any curiosity, or if you want to know, is this correct or not, I can answer you, especially about the units, about certain other aspects of how things worked on the field, or that I explained in the other video, but in general for these cultures, for their civilizations, etc. As you know, we make videos about this stuff from a strictly historical point of view. So, given that I know that many of you actually come from this background, as I do, I think it can be useful, and it can be a way to say, okay, what should I know that those mods maybe prevented me from understanding correctly, and etc. That can be an interesting exercise, because especially I can tell you that as a modder, you pose yourself problems that others do not quite see, because at the end of the day you want to be very precise with the mechanisms, with the reasons, the causes, like what brings to something appearing a way rather than another, right? And if the ultimate goal is to create something more accurate, I think that there are certain specific aspects that must be considered. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.